in 1569, the English did not take up the trade again in earnest until the 1640s. Elizabeth I did not expel Africans from England in 1596. Rather, her Privy Council issued a limited licence to an unscrupulous merchant named Caspar van Senden, who was only allowed to transport individuals out of England with their master's consent, a consent that he utterly failed to obtain. And although much has been written on the question of racism in Shakespeare's Othello, we mustn't forget that it was a work of fiction designed to entertain, and so must be set alongside archival evidence of how Africans were treated in England's churches, households and law courts. The misconceptions surrounding the status of black Tudors are part of a wider impression that any African living outside Africa before the mid-19th century, be it in Europe or the Americas, must have been enslaved. When most of us think of a slave, the image that appears in our minds is of an African. There is more than enough visual material to draw upon, from films such as 12 Years a Slave, and television series such as Roots, to the exhibits at museums such as the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool and the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery at Museum of London Docklands. Often the first and only mention of Africa in the school curriculum is when children are taught about the slave trade. They see Africans reduced to one of a series of commodities traded in a triangle, packed into ships and chains. Equal attention is not given to the extensive history of Africa before the Europeans arrived there, and to examples of collaboration between Europeans and Africans, or to the free Africans living in Europe. Not all slaves were African. The word slave itself comes from Slav, referring to the Slavonic peoples of Eastern Europe, who were enslaved in great numbers by the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto the Great, and his successors from the 10th century onwards. And more than 1 million white Europeans were enslaved in North Africa between 1530 and 1780, having been captured from the shores of England, Ireland, France, Spain and Portugal by the Barbary pirates. Contemporary concerns naturally shape the questions we ask about our past. It is difficult for us in the 21st century to push aside the nationalist myth of the Tudors created by 19th century imperialists and imagine an England before the emergence of the British Empire. Tudor England was a small, relatively weak kingdom on the edge of Europe, which had not yet experienced the full horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and colonial plantation slavery. These abominations, alongside the imperialism and scientific racism that followed, cast their shadows across almost every discussion of the history of Africans in Britain. Today, immigration and the question of whether institutional racism is endemic to society bedevil political discourse. These issues may be the source of our questions, but they cannot be allowed to shape our conclusions about the past. The answers are complex, but the questions that most commonly spring to mind about the Black Tudors are simple. Why and how did they come to England? How were they treated? What were their lives like? To understand how and why Africans came to England, we must look to the dramatic developments going on in the wider world. In a century dominated by the Spanish and Portuguese, England was small fry on the global stage. Following Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492, the Iberian powers carved up the world between them in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Spain laid claim to the New World of South America and the Caribbean, while Portugal looked to Africa and the East Indies. Their empires were united from 1580 under the rule of Philip II. Strangely enough, it was the death of the young Portuguese king, Dom Sebastian, on African soil, at the Battle of Alcazar in 1578, that allowed Philip of Spain to annex the Portuguese crown and become the dreaded universal monarch, establishing a global dominion on which the sun never set. The Portuguese had been the first Europeans to visit Africa en route to India in the 15th century. They brought the first enslaved Africans to Europe in 1444. From then, a substantial black population developed across southern Europe, with smaller numbers appearing in the more